All right, everybody, we are going live now. So, welcome everyone. Good evening and welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Thanks for joining us tonight. If you haven't before, The Breakdown is a monthly web series that focuses on everything housing here in Santa Fe and across the state. My name is Michael Barrio and I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition. Basically, we're a broad coalition of community partners and stakeholders concerned with creating and ensuring an equitable and accessible housing landscape for all of us, Santa Fe and New Mexico. And I'll also be your host tonight. So tonight, we'll be focused on all things renters' rights, evictions, moratoria, landlord relations, and everything in between. And this is an especially important topic right now, as we know that moratoria have been put in place nationally, are coming to an end at the end of this month. What I've been hearing and reading about is understandably a lot of anxiety about what happens to thousands, like more than 100,000 New Mexicans when the moratorium ends. And as you might already know, the CDC eviction moratorium that was implemented late last year ordered that renters should be protected from eviction if they were unable to pay their rent due to hardships like job loss, income loss, or medical expenses. The protection began in September of 2020, and it's set to end, like I said, at the end of this year. So what's important to note, I suppose, is that the CDC eviction moratorium was not automatic protection against eviction. And I feel like this is something that a lot of people weren't really aware of. Renters were required to complete a declaration document and then give that to their landlord to get the protection. And then, even then, landlords could and did still try to file eviction lawsuits against renters. And this was something that we saw across the state. And not only here in New Mexico, this was something that was going on nationally. According to recent reports, like I said, more than 100,000 New Mexicans could soon be facing evictions from their homes, and tens of thousands are facing utilities getting shut off. Last month, the moratoria on disconnections expired for small water, gas, and rural electric co-ops, which the PRC Commissioner Joe Maestas said covers about 3/4 of the state, which is crazy. Just think about that in terms of numbers. And according to a KRQE report, more than 21,000 people that those companies serve have accounts that are past due, with a total debt of $7.5 million, and 75% of those people are now eligible for disconnection. Crazy. As for rent, the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty, and Maria can speak to this later, said that the most recent data shows that anywhere from 50,000 to 105,000 New Mexicans are at risk of eviction. So just kind of let that sink in. At a national level, billions of dollars from Congress were set aside to help people avoid eviction, but the problem is that those funds haven't really reached many of the people who need them. At the same time, according to a recent NPR report, 7 million Americans are behind on their rent. And so with the federal moratorium on eviction expiring in just a few weeks, that could lead to a massive new wave of evictions. And that's probably something that we've already been reading a lot about. The thing is, Congress has approved this huge pile of money to help people pay their back rent and then not be evicted. But a lot of them aren't getting it, and why not? I mean, we're talking about $50 billion, and that money goes to the states, right? But then it gets diverted in a million different directions, to the states, the county, city level. And then according to the same NPR report, there's about 370 different programs taking application checks to renters and landlords. But they all have different success rates too. I could go on, but we've got a show to do, and I have guests that can speak to all of the stuff that I'm talking about. So tonight, I'm happy to have some incredible folks joining for this discussion. I've got Maria Griego from the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty. I've got Riley Mass from New Mexico Legal Aid, and New Mexico State Representatives Andrea Romero and Angelica Rubio, all of whom have been focused on and working really hard to address renters' rights and related issues since the start of the pandemic. So welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to have you with me tonight. Let's just jump right in. I guess I want to start with where we are right now. We keep hearing about a coming wave of evictions that threatens to unsettle and disrupt the lives of thousands of New Mexicans and their families across the state. So I guess I want to start by, what are we talking about here? What are the concerns and what are the realities? Are you finding or hearing about landlords ignoring the moratoria and continuing to evict? Is this a widespread problem here in New Mexico?
I'll just jump right in. Hi, everyone. Great to have you. This is the most important topic as far as I'm concerned, as far as the safety, health, and well-being of New Mexicans. We have forever said, since we've been on this mission to ensure that folks have safe and stable housing, that it is the best social program that we have. So while folks are facing instability and while moratoriums are being questioned, I know that Representative Rubio and I are increasingly getting information that folks have been violating the moratorium. Not folks, but rather the courts have not been following the moratorium. We know of at least 300 cases in Albuquerque that are being investigated for those who have been evicted despite the moratorium. So there's a lot of confusion, I think, in the legal system with what is happening, what people's rights are. Meanwhile, we're getting information that even despite all of the challenges of getting to court, should you be issued an eviction notice, that there are more folks that can participate in their hearings because of Zoom, because of the ability to access, information in this virtual world we're living in. They've been able to participate in those programs. However, the legal sort of backing for folks in those vulnerable positions have not, unfortunately, been met. So they're not getting the resources that they need when they need it. A lot of continuations, should they be granted, are continuing to go on. I'm sure Maria knows a bit more about that, but I'm a student in the economic justice clinic at the UNM Law School. So now we're at the front lines of seeing a lot of that happening. And so it's great to kind of be both and as a citizen legislator and seeing this happening, but it's unfortunate because, again, folks are being evicted, not really knowing their rights, not really knowing that there's $160 million out there that they can apply for with not a lot of constraint right now, really just having to prove that you've had financial difficulty, anywhere from I had to quit my job to stay home to take care of my kids to, I'm now taking care of a grandparent or another person that's living with me. And those all create financial constraints. So we can talk about that more, but the reality is that there's a lot of resources right now that we really fought for the past year to get for folks to be able to pay for their rent. And we still have a moratorium. So there are some opportunities right now, which we really asked for. So for all of the things that we wanted to happen, we have a month to critically make that happen while we still have a moratorium in place. But nevertheless, we need to make sure that folks have information about getting that money into their pockets so that they can pay their rent. And even the landlords are on our side right now because definitely they want to get paid. So I know that was a broad answer to your question, but we're still seeing a lot of evictions still happening throughout the state and are still trying to get information on it.
Yeah, and just to sort of clarify the legal aspect about the moratorium, it doesn't mean that landlords cannot file for eviction. They still can file for eviction. And in order to take advantage of either the CDC moratorium or the New Mexico State Supreme Court order that stays issuance of the writ of restitution, which is the document that orders the sheriff to physically remove people from a rental unit. Lost track of my thoughts. What it means is, so landlords can still file for eviction, and to take advantage of those protections, the tenant has to show up in court and essentially prove to the judge that they have a current inability to pay rent. So I think there was a lot of misconception, both among landlords and tenants, that evictions couldn't be filed, period, when these protections were first put into place last year. But I think as more people are becoming aware of the protections, and then as the CDC moratorium is expiring, the New Mexico State Supreme Court stay is currently still in effect. There's no we're not aware of any movement to lift it at the moment, but it could be lifted should the Supreme Court decide to do that. But I think as more people realize that they can file for eviction, more cases are starting to be filed.
Right. And so, I mean, I think that's a super important distinction that you're making. And I think something that people didn't generally understand, as you say. And so I guess, and I want to come back to this problem. I want to come back to this question. I want to come back to Maria and Angelica as well, about, just what are you finding and what are you hearing, and, what does the problem look like? But I guess what I'm also interested in is what do renters actually have to be worried about right now? Like what are well-founded concerns, right? Because we know that there's a lot of misinformation. We know that, I mean, if I'm being honest, all the moratoria stuff, everything that's kind of surrounding this issue of like potential evictions and all of that stuff, it's kind of confusing, right? It's a little convoluted. And I think, as we've seen with nearly every issue for at least the last 10 years, right, is that there's so much noise about any and every issue that it's hard to kind of sift through the facts and figure out, well, what's the problem? What do I actually have to be worried about? And then, what does it mean? How does it apply to me? And what can I do about it? So again, what are the actual like well-founded concerns that people have right now?
So I'll just kind of dovetail on what Riley was saying. So, all along the moratoria have been about inability to pay rent. So you have to prove an inability to pay rent, and a court cannot evict if a tenant shows up to court and says they have an inability to pay rent. What we have seen almost all along is that as leases started to expire, because most residential leases are 1 year, so by now virtually every lease that was in effect at the time the moratoria were put in place has expired. Landlords would take tenants to court even when it was really an underlying inability to pay rent issue, and they'd say, well, I'm not evicting because of an inability to pay rent. I'm evicting because the lease has run up and I just choose not to renew it, and the person has not vacated the property. So we've seen that all along, and so that has been and will continue to be a well-founded fear that if you are not able to pay rent, but you are now outside of a 1 year lease, if you're like on a month to month, your landlord can take you to court and say, I just choose not to renew the lease. And that unfortunately is a loophole that many landlords have used, and that courts are, granting, are ordering that tenants move from their home based on that. So that is really troubling. The other thing is, although, Representative Romero said a lot of the landlords are working, they want to get paid. We do see in New Mexico and across the country, there are many landlords who are choosing not to take rental assistance money. And I think it's not really clear why. There's a lot of speculation about why. I mean, some of the smaller landlords we've heard are taking advantage of the housing market we are in. So homes, you're hearing all over the news about homes selling for way more than they're worth, getting offers way above asking price. And so there is some financial incentive for smaller landlords who maybe own a small house. Rather than taking rental assistance, they might want to just put their home up on the market and take advantage of the additional funds that they might be able to get now. So that's concerning. There's also been talk that maybe landlords are disincentivized from taking the rental assistance because it might create some sort of tax implication for them. They do have to fill out a W-9 when they receive rental assistance money. So there's a lot of money available, but what we have heard is that some of the agencies like DFA are having trouble getting that money out for a variety of reasons.
And Representative Rubio, were you gonna say something? I saw you on mute, and then.
No, thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone. I'm really glad to be here, and I don't know if it's I know it's easier for me to sort of explain sort of like the arc or the history in terms of how we sort of got here, at least within the last year, because as a legislator serving with Representative Romero, it was very telling that last year when the pandemic began, her and I were just sort of wondering why no one was talking about this housing issue, particularly within the legislature. And it was very, very concerning. And so we were lucky enough to connect with Maria and Riley and others to really start thinking about what was it that needed to be addressed almost immediately. And what we have known for a while is that New Mexico already had a housing crisis, and so the pandemic just really just magnified the issues that we're facing here in the state. And so part of the effort that Representative Romero and I were doing was really working and persisting the legislature and the governor to take this issue seriously. And we had a special session last June, we had a special session in December, and then of course we had a regular session in January. And each of those sessions, we were proposing legislation to specifically address not only issues related to the pandemic and how to support tenants and landlords, but also to address all of the things that at least some of the things that led us to this moment and why we already have a crisis. And unfortunately, I mean, me and Representative Romero were just exchanging some text that I think there's still not a level of urgency from leadership around this issue, which is incredibly, I think, worrisome, because of the fact that if we're experiencing all these things that Maria has shared and what Riley has shared and Representative Romero, and it's like this this bottleneck that we're experiencing where you have policymakers not seeing the sense of urgency, and then us as advocates like pushing as hard as we can. We introduced legislation this past year to try to address even just some of the fundamental pieces that we think would support tenants and landlords. And we had like 7 hearings on this legislation. We kept making corrections and working with the Landlord Association and others to try to make it the best piece of legislation. We got it out of the House, and it just sat in the Senate and Senate Judiciary, and then the session died. I mean, the session ended and our legislation died. So I feel like we're here like yelling at the top of our lungs about this housing issue that's taking place here in the state of New Mexico. Meanwhile, we're still dealing with policymakers and others who I don't think they quite understand the magnitude of this crisis. And this is going to be very consequential for a generation of New Mexicans, where if we don't address it now, like I don't even want to think about what might happen or what will happen if we're not addressing this immediately.
Right. And, you know, it's so crazy that, I mean, like you say, that it doesn't seem to be an issue that's as elevated as it should be, which is strange because it's so pervasive and it's so integrated into so many other issues, right? It's so important, for example, to the sustainability of our economy, for one thing, right? And so you'd think that alone would be enough incentive to elevate this to a higher priority, right? I mean, I don't know how we can say that any economic development plan is comprehensive or complete if it doesn't include any kind of provisions or considerations for the housing landscape, right? If it doesn't address housing policy, I don't think that you can say that that's a comprehensive plan or that it's particularly strategic, right? So, and I'm glad that you brought up the legislation, because I was going to ask about, you know, yeah, during the 2021 session, which was wild, you both worked on that legislation that would have specifically addressed all of this stuff. And I was just about to ask, what happened? I mean, we know Senate Judiciary happened, and that, I mean, isn't that usually what happens? But you know, that happened. Why didn't that go any further? I mean, I feel like we saw a lot of support, right, from the advocacy groups as usual, I think one of the issues is that you brought up earlier was that there's a need for more visibility about this discussion and the topic, and for more inclusion, right? So that more people are talking about it and are able to share their concerns as well as their opinions, and ask questions. And so I think that, that's one thing that leadership and that all of us can do a better job of, I guess, is really making sure that we continue to talk about it, and that we continue to talk about it in a way that invites participation. Because what I'm seeing from a coalition standpoint is that there's just so much misinformation out there, and that so many people have, all these anxieties and fears that they're not really sure where to direct that energy, and oftentimes it's misplaced. Of course, publicly elected officials are responsible for addressing these things, but there are a lot of other pieces that are at play, right? And so I feel like just having these conversations is a really good start, right? So let's see here.
I was just gonna dovetail with that, if I may, Michael, just because we don't have a real place in state government other than the Mortgage Finance Authority to have these conversations that just got brought up at our Courts, Corrections, and Justice interim hearing, that would we be hearing housing crisis issues in that place. So I think a lot of folks go, where do we have that? Is it an economic development problem? Is it a health problem? Is it a justice problem? All of the above. But the truth is, where do we have that discussion and have it wholly so that everyone's informed? And I think that's part of where Representative Rubio and I have not been able to have that traction, because the conversation does span into all of those directions. So how we may be able to really house that, pun intended, is really a place that we might be able to continue to facilitate that, so that our entire legislature understands the problem and the solutions that we posed as well.
Right. And I see we had a question. I'm going to get to questions in just a second. But I wanted to see, did Riley or Maria want to chime in on that before I move along? All right. Let's go ahead. What's that? Go ahead, Maria.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yeah, so I just, you asked what happened with the legislation, and yes, it got stuck in Senate Judiciary, but the legislation, House Bill 111, which is what we're talking about, had three pieces. And the first was a prohibition against source of income discrimination. The second biggest piece was changes to the Uniform Owner-Resident Relations Act, which would have done a lot of things, but most importantly would have expanded timeframes for renters facing eviction. So giving them more time to pay once they're late, giving them more time before a hearing so they can secure a lawyer, if they're ordered to be evicted, giving them more time to pack up their belongings and find a new place. And then the third piece was the creation of a state housing council. And so, as Representative Romero was saying, we don't have this anywhere in our state that's one unit that addresses housing. It's very fractured. Our state's very fractured in terms of how we address housing. And so that piece didn't get a lot of support, ended up being stripped away. And then the source of income discrimination actually got a lot of backlash.
Could you say a little bit more for the audience about what that means, the source of income?
Sure. So the best example and what it was primarily designed to target was landlords who refuse to accept Section 8. But it could be any type of housing assistance, any type of lawful income, actually. So oftentimes landlords will have a minimum income requirement that says you have to earn X amount of dollars from a job, to be able to rent our home or whatever. This provision would have made it illegal for landlords to turn anyone away from paying their rent with any type of lawful income. So Section 8, child support, Social Security income, any lawful source of income. Because what we hear about over and over and over again, and Riley might be able to speak to this more, is that folks who are on Section 8 have an incredibly difficult time finding a place to live. There are very few units, especially in Albuquerque, that that take Section 8. And what we hear is that more really the landlords that tend to take Section 8 are have units in some of the more unsafe neighborhoods that aren't very family friendly. And so it ends up pushing folks out to the margins who are on Section 8. They can't just go rent any apartment that they could afford to rent. And so, you know, it's a real problem. Lack of affordable housing stock is a real problem in our state. And so that would have gone it would have been huge leaps and bounds for housing in New Mexico. But we couldn't get landlords on board, and there was a lot of opposition even within the legislature on the source of income discrimination prohibition. And, you know, a lot of it, I think, is just these preconceived notions about, you know, who are the tenants that are on Section 8. And there's a really bad stigma and preconceived notion that they are, you know, tenants who aren't going to keep the unit clean or who are going to party and be on drugs. And that's just not necessarily the case. So by the time we were in Senate Judiciary and never got a hearing in Senate Judiciary, all that was left of the bill was the changes to the Uniform Owner-Resident Relations Act, which still would have done great things for our state. But the source of income, the prohibition against source of income discrimination and the Housing Council were still really important pieces that just didn't get the support that they needed. And like I said, there was just a lot of pushback, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that we don't have a cabinet level position that is explicitly focused on housing. That seems like a huge opportunity. And I really don't understand why that's, but I guess one of the things I'm wondering about then is, what do you feel like the likelihood is of creating you know, a statewide housing council down the road? Like, what does the reality of that actually look like? I know there are a lot of people that are really interested in continuing the conversation, but what does that mean in politics, right? It's just, I mean, that's just, we say that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think there's so many ways for us to have that, again, that conversation with the Mortgage Finance Authority, which is a quasi-governmental organization, and our legislators sit on that committee in the interim and moving forward. But there's a lot of competing for resources, right? So they're already sort of baked into our state system. And when we're having these discussions about developing a new housing council or perhaps a housing department, we've had one before in the past, and unfortunately that was an epic failure. And a lot of folks who know that history are very reluctant to start again and repeat history again. So we're in a different era, but how do we do that? You know, understanding the bureaucracy and understanding that many of our departments already have a mechanism for housing within them. Again, our Health and Human Services has a housing component. Our even corrections for transitional housing. There's so many different components to this. So how do we convene all of those powers that be for now? And that was what the council would do. But again, when we have a council, it also has to be appointed by our governor. So that was actually, we had great support for it, but the bottleneck that's created when we have to have an appointment and need to do something within a year, that was the real challenge actually in getting the work that we needed to get done without having a formalized council. So if we wanted to start the housing council right here, we actually could, and I would encourage all those who want to be a part of that would. And that's sort of how we're still having these discussions now, is galvanizing that policy support despite having gubernatorial appointments. Let's just have that conversation, and if Rep Rubio and I can formalize that for everyone, we'll sign whatever we need to get you on this informal council. But that's really where we're at. And so from the politics side, there is a concern. And I think a lot of people, once they understand the problems that we're facing, and again, as Rep Rubio said, we're already in a crisis. So there is political will there, but the timing and the means of being able to get there, and then again, getting it into the budget. You know, there was a $12 million ask for the Housing Trust Fund that didn't even get a hearing as well. So how do we start looking at the mechanics of these things and getting them in? And I know Rep Rubio and I'm only in my second term, so learning how to do that for me is so critical, so that when we work with advocates like you, that we can actually make it work together.
Yeah. And with regard to just, getting it into the budget, right? That's always like, oh, we got to get it into the budget. And this is something we had to face, when I was working on our initiative to get the Affordable Housing Trust Fund funded in Santa Fe. And that, so everyone's always go, well, how do we get it into the budget? And my first question is, well, why the hell wasn't it in the budget in the first place? I don't understand why in a city's budget, you wouldn't have a line item for housing. Again, it's just, a lot of the times I'm thinking like, okay, we have all of these really smart people that are coming up with these long-term strategies for, like for economic development and stuff. And then those things, get out the gate pretty quickly. And then it's like, but wait, there's no line item in the budget for housing, and the economic development plan didn't flag that or catch that or, include that in their plan. Like who's thinking through these things? It's just kind of, it's maddening to me, because it's something that obviously, I mean, you all understand this as well, but it's something that we work on every day. And, to see it, to hear people say, oh, well, we need to work on getting it into the budget. And that's the hard part. And it reminds me of a quote by our current president, who, I mean, we can talk about what our opinions are of the current administration later, but I will say, I love this quote. I'll tell you what your priorities are when you show me what's in your budget, or something like that. But that was the point. It's like, yes, if it's not in your budget, how can you tell me that that's a priority, right? And so that's my big question, not only for local governments, but our state government at large, right? Like you can't tell me with a straight face that this is a priority if it's not in your budget.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and I think Representative Romero mentioned it, is that we're learning so much of how complex and frustrating this legislature can be, and the budget process is one of those things where I think people assume that we go in January and we start with the process. Then no, we have committees
Interim, right?
that are actively, and it's not just like, I mean, you have to be a voting member to be able to participate in these committees. And I mean, I'll be completely frank and say that many of the people who serve on these committees do not value housing in the way that Representative Romero and I, and many of us on this call do. And so I think that's the issue that we face when we're talking about budgets, is that part of the work is how are we, especially when it comes to this issue around housing rights, and the work that's required is like, how are we changing the hearts and minds of the people that are working or that are serving within these committees to understand the plight that folks right now are experiencing? Because as of now, it doesn't seem like it's quite the priority, and we have to, and that's part of the advocacy work that needs to be happening right now, is that what calls are being made um like on a daily basis to folks both who serve on this legislative finance committee, to make sure that come January that we do have funding that's going to address these issues. And like you mentioned earlier, so much is intersectional when it comes to this issue around housing. It's not just housing. It's a number of issues with like infrastructure around affordable housing acts. Like there's just so many different things that we need to be addressing. And it's sort of like deconstructing the legislature, which I'm down to work towards. But it's really, how do we how do we work towards doing that so that our issues get prioritized?
Right. So I guess what I want to get to next is, and I think Maria and Riley can really help with this, is so if landlords threaten to evict tenants or actually move forward with it right now, what recourse do renters have?
So, like I was saying earlier, there's nothing that prohibits a landlord from actually filing an eviction. If the eviction is based on non-payment of rent, then the tenant can show up at the hearing and either take advantage of the New Mexico Supreme Court stay, which means they will still get a judgment entered against them. It's just that the sheriff won't come to their house and evict them. And for the CDC moratorium, they can provide the landlord with a declaration saying, attesting that they have a current inability to pay rent. Of course, there are some courts in New Mexico that are saying that doesn't apply in New Mexico. And it's expiring at the end of this month. But those protections only apply to cases based on non-payment of rent. And so if a tenant were to go to court and say, and show that they have a current inability to pay rent and they still get evicted, then they could file an appeal. They could potentially file a lawsuit against the landlord for unlawful eviction. But because the time frame of these evictions is so short in New Mexico, like if a judge were to enter a judgment and say, okay, I find you evicted, I find you haven't paid the rent, you can't take advantage of this stay for whatever reason, then the writ of restitution, which is what orders the sheriff to evict someone, is issued 7 to 10 days. It's 7 to 10 days out from the date of the hearing, generally.
Okay.
So there's very little time to seek legal help or to file an appeal or all of that stuff, to even just pack up and move out if you don't want to fight it. But really, in reality, there is very, very little recourse for tenants that have been, I mean, the only thing I can think of for someone who has been wrongfully evicted, it's one, very hard to get back into a unit if you've already been kicked out.
Mhm.
Like that's nearly impossible. I think in my 4 years as an attorney, I've seen that happen in one case. So that's one thing. But I would say the most important thing that tenants could do is call New Mexico Legal Aid as free legal services for low-income people who qualify. We obviously don't have the capacity to represent everyone, but we do our best to provide some kind of service to everyone that qualifies. So if you think you have you've been unlawfully evicted, I would say seek legal assistance.
Awesome, thank you. And if
To
you
add to that,
if you guys could share your contact information for your organizations, that would be awesome. Representative?
yeah, I just wanted to talk about preventing eviction before it happens, if I can, because we're still in that stage where folks may still be able to fight that. And when you get an eviction on your record, it really hurts seeking future housing. And that's just kind of one of those unfortunate, burdensome things, especially if it was just for non-payment of rent. And this is something, again, we worked really, really hard to get the resources available. So renthelpnm.org, just burn this in your brain. Renthelpnm.org is a place for folks who are seeking support for their rent money, can help work with their landlord. And often judges will basically say, look, I've applied to this program. I've been in a financial, situation that has been pretty rough since COVID hit or wherever else, or, it could be in the last few months. This will give you up to 5 months of rent if you qualify, and it's solely based upon income qualification. There's this tool that'll help you understand that. It's through through the HUD program. Federally, I just Googled for it, like, how do I find out if I qualify for this program? And so we can help their legal aid. And then I know that the UNM School of Law clinic also is taking on these cases as well. So there's a lot of legal support out there, but more than anything, there's financial support. And I can guarantee your landlord would probably want you to just continue to pay your rent if they like you, you know, to want to stay there and stay in a situation where it's stable for you, stable for them. And that's how we came to these agreements. Even while we were in this legislative session, they were understanding that it really benefits them when they can get paid and they like their tenants, especially if it's just for non-payment of rent. We just want to get these resources out there. There's tons of ads, but if you know somebody that's faced financial hardship, they're having trouble paying rent, and we know how expensive it is where I live in Santa Fe, it's outrageous. And so if you can get some help because you've been at all financially, you know, hurt by the pandemic, maybe even just a few months of lost wages, or you were transitioning somehow, all of those things matter. So there's help for you and or anybody else, your neighbors, your friends, your relatives who can seek the support. And we have this money until September of this year, $160 million, and we've only spent about 2 million of it at this point. So we really need to get on the ball so that folks are not afraid to do this, to feel informed and to feel supported in this process. So I'm seeing a chat question about helping with utilities, etc. Yes, they will look at your financial situation and help with what they can. They're looking at all of the above, and that's what this fund is for. So please take a look at renthelpnm.org.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I've actually partnered with the DFA to host a statewide info session, and that's actually happening tomorrow. And I'll go ahead and share the link for that in the chat and also in the comments on Facebook Live. But basically, it's focused on the DFA's emergency rental assistance program, and it's a bilingual session, which is critical. And it's a general session that helps people understand what the program is, how it works, who can apply, you know, who's eligible. And then there's going to be time for Q&A as well, because people are having some issues kind of, you know, just understanding and getting through the process, so we can make that easier for them. And that's what the point of doing this is tomorrow. So I'm going to go ahead and share that with you all. And I'll share the link as well. But I'm also going to be hosting two other things, which are equally important. The same program, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, I'm going to be hosting a training session for providers and organizations that are interested in helping their communities and constituencies understand the program and how to apply and all that stuff. I'm going to be also doing 2 additional events, which are similar, for the Emergency Mortgage Assistance Program, right, to tackle the mortgage side, the homeowners, right? So that's going to be happening on July 6th. I'll be able to provide more details as those come. I'm partnering with a host of other organizations to do that as well. So if you pay attention to our Facebook profile, my Twitter account, what else? Our Instagram, we're everywhere. So pay attention there. The whole point is to make sure that we get, make sure that people understand what the program is, that it's out there, and making sure that people have some support when they're trying to understand how to get assistance. So super, super important stuff. Please make sure to share the event tomorrow with your folks. And tune in if you can. The DFA is going to be sharing all of that really important information. So now I want to go ahead and move on to questions. I know we have them. So I'm going to go ahead and just open it up. Mac, I know you've been waiting. Thank you for hanging in.
Thanks for all the information, and thanks for all of you who are serving. I just wanted to dovetail on a couple of comments from Maria and Riley. Riley, you were talking about what renters are really scared of. In this town, they're really scared of slumlords. I hear it all the time. and it's pernicious. And going through legal aid or the landlord tenant hotline doesn't really matter because there's nobody to enforce those laws. You can get a judgment if you go to court, but that doesn't mean that anything will be enforced outside of monetarily. And the perpetrator is simply allowed to do it again, to continue renting a very dangerous spot where, in some cases, as with carbon monoxide poisoning, and that happens every year, people die. And there's no teeth in that. So while you're considering all of these other issues, I would just ask you to kindly consider, we have so many people here because we have such a challenge with housing, and they live in really substandard housing. And the landlords, they basically, don't care, and they'll find someone else. So that's what I wanted to share with you all, is that this is a very pernicious, and it seems to be fairly widespread.
Definitely. Thank you.
There you have it. No comments? Nobody has a comment or an observation on any of those comments?
I mean, I completely agree with you, and that is an issue that I represent tenants in eviction cases and otherwise, but condition issues are often raised, and unfortunately there's really not a lot we can do to force the landlord to make the changes after a tenant moves out of a unit. I mean, it's just not something that I have had clients call code enforcement, and that sometimes code enforcement will issue an order against a landlord saying they're unsafe conditions, but I mean, it's just not something that we really have the ability to force landlords to do.
Well, it's interesting because, let me just interject this one thing, and then please feel free. There are laws to support all of these things, but there's nobody that enforces them. That was my only point, and I'm sorry for interrupting.
No worry. I mean, I think that's a really important point. This is something that I deal with in, I've been dealing with in an advocacy role for some time, is that as advocates, we spend a lot of time advocating for policy change and for funds for various initiatives, right? But I feel like there's a huge opportunity for us to begin advocating. And if many of us are doing this already, just leave this comment where it is. But I think we can do a lot more in terms of advocating for capacity, right? Because we can make policy change, we can introduce new programs and things like that. But if the departments and people that are tasked to actually implement all that stuff, if that's not there, that's where things start to fall through the cracks. And I think one example that I always point to is in Albuquerque. I think at the beginning of this year, or maybe it was at late last year, but something like over $700,000 in Section 8 vouchers were left on the table because they just couldn't get them out the door. And that's a huge problem. That's a capacity issue, right?
Section 8 has standards. I'm talking about situations where, because they're private, you rent a casita or
Right.
something along those lines.
But it's the same kinds of things, right?
There are laws.
Who implements those? Who actually pays attention to and enforces those kinds of regulations? And that too is a capacity issue.
I called our mayor's office, because I live in the city, to see if there was any organization or department that dealt with this. And I couldn't get past the woman who picked up the phone, who actually didn't care. I'm sorry, my phone just exploded.
No worries.
I asked for constituent services and spoke with a woman who she alleged she was with constituent services. And when I asked her if she knew if there was a department, she's like, I don't know. And then I said, can you find out? And she said it wasn't her job. So at that point, I just kind of left City Hall alone. But there's all this stuff. Part of it is private, private individuals, and then there's the government part and the legal part, and there's just the wires are all crossed, and it's allowed to continue, and it's off brand for Santa Fe. I will tell you that.
Yeah.
Take that for what you
To
will.
another question. Thank you, Mac. I want to get to another question that was submitted on Facebook. So are there protections for when people are applying for rentals? It's been very competitive, and they let so many people pay the application fee, then choose on very arbitrary criteria. In some states, they have to accept the first applicant that meets requirements. Anybody want to address that? Riley, Maria, I'm looking at you.
Sure.
Oh,
So,
and if you've been wondering, please excuse my huge mug of coffee. I'm operating on 5 hours of sleep here.
so, earlier I mentioned we were trying to amend the New Mexico Human Rights Act to include a prohibition against source of income discrimination. Unfortunately, we didn't get as far as we would have liked with this legislative session, but there is still a prohibition. There are many prohibitions in the New Mexico Human Rights Act that prohibit, a landlord from discriminating based on race, nationality, ethnicity. Riley, what else am I missing? Religion,
Familial status,
familial status.
gender.
Yeah. So
yeah, religion. Yeah.
yeah. So there are a lot of protections in there. Of course, it can be certainly a challenge if you're saying, that you have to prove that that's why a landlord rejected you, right? And so a landlord could say, look, I chose to rent to this other person because they didn't have an eviction on their record, and the other person that filed the complaint did have an eviction on their record. So it can be a little bit challenging to prove, but those protections are there. And if you think that you've been discriminated against because of one of those reasons that we just enumerated, the New Mexico's weird. In New Mexico, the New Mexico Department of Workforce Solutions investigates those complaints of discrimination. So I know that doesn't seem like the obvious place you would go to, but that is where you go to if you have a complaint about discrimination. The issue about taking the application fees, I hear that a lot, and it's something that I think needs to be looked at on a systemic basis. Where landlords just accept it, and then it's non-refundable, you don't get it back, and probably something has to be done about that. So I'm glad that this has been flagged again, because it's something that we should be looking at. If perhaps legislation about requiring a refundable, a deposit if you're ultimately not selected. But yeah, good question.
Thank you. All right, do we have any other questions that I can get to? I don't. Let's see.
No, I'll just fill some time with what Maria was talking about, just because I've worked with, again, there was a crisis before this crisis. Supportive housing in our state is stretched so thin. All the areas where people can get jobs, they can't live because, of course, of affordability. So again, that constraint of filing paperwork properly on time, having that advocacy, we need to increase that capacity. I've had tenants, or not tenants, but rather constituents, reach out just saying, can you help me make sure that this is filed properly? So, things like that, I think, and I don't want to speak for legal aid, but I don't know if they'll check for being able to make sure that paperwork is filed, following up the process. I see that the renter's guide is in there, but I think just asking those questions, if I need supportive housing, just want to make sure and check on my paperwork that I can do this properly, so that when it does get to the top of the pile, that I'm good to go. So Riley, is that something that?
Are you talking about like paperwork in applying for supportive housing?
Yeah, would you help with that? I'm just curious.
It sort of depends on the situation. So we can really only address like a legal issue, but if there was some issue with someone being denied from a supportive service, that's definitely an issue that I've dealt with. But in terms of helping people fill out the paperwork, unfortunately, that's not really something that we can do because it's not really a legal issue, but we would love to have a social worker here. So maybe we'll get funding for that someday.
All right. Thank you, Riley. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Andrea. Representative, sorry. All right. So I just want to, before I get to kind of final thoughts, and I'll give you all an opportunity to leave us with a final thought or a resource that we haven't talked about yet. But I just want to remind everyone again that I'm going to be hosting an info session for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program with the DFA tomorrow. So please be sure to tune in to that if that is something that you feel like could be helpful to you. And aside from that, I just want to take some time to sincerely thank both the representatives for your incredible and important work, both before session and during session and after session. I think that we all know the work doesn't ever end. I don't think it's going to go away, but we just got to keep pushing. And Maria and Riley, thank you so much for everything that you do. We know that you're on the ground and you're seeing all of this stuff, and I think on top of the hard work that it is for all of us, right, that are on this panel right now, what a lot of people maybe aren't talking about also is that we're seeing a lot of things, whether we're on the ground and we're doing direct service or whether we're working on the policy side or maybe both, especially during a pandemic, that takes a huge emotional toll, right? And it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of it just takes a lot out of you, and to continue to power through and to continue to fight for these issues and for the people that really need our help really takes a lot. And so I just want to say thank you so much for everything that all of you are doing. I really appreciate it. And I know that the people of New Mexico really appreciate you as well. So again, thank you so much for that. So I want to go ahead and move to final thoughts. If anybody has any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, let's go. I'll start with Maria.
So not necessarily a final thought, but something I wanted to mention when Mac had a question earlier, and that was her question was about recourse for when a landlord is not, caring for the property. And one option is rent abatement. And I'm going to ask Riley if she would be so kind to give the specifics about rent abatement. But essentially, that's when you give your landlord notice that something isn't working, and they have 7 days to correct it. And if they don't correct it, you can withhold a portion of your rent. But I'm going to ask Riley to give the specifics.
Yeah, and that is a recourse. I guess when I was saying there's not a lot we can do to force a landlord to make repairs, for one thing, that is kind of a limited solution, but also I guess I was addressing more having a landlord re-rent a not safe apartment. But for abatement, yeah, if there's a repair issue, a tenant can give a 7-day notice in writing saying these are the issues that need to be addressed. And if you don't make repairs within the 7 days, then I'm going to withhold. It's a lot of people actually think it's the full rent. It's not. It's 1/3 of the daily rent for each day that the condition was not repaired. So it's sort of a complex calculation, and the risk with doing that, with withholding rent, is that the landlord can then file for an eviction based on non-payment. So that's why it's good to keep records, take pictures of the condition issues, keep all of that so you can prevent the eviction based on that, which is retaliation under the law, I would argue.
Thank you, Riley.
All right.
That's all. I just wanted to add that. But thank you for having me tonight, Michael. It was great discussion.
Yeah, thank you for being here. All right, representatives, anything you want to leave us with? All right. Well, thank you all.
Oh, I will. Sorry. Just because renthelpnm.org. I was like, go ahead, rep. Renthelpnm.org. I cannot say enough that the federal government is funding rent right now for those in need. And we really, really, really want to spend all of this money. We do not want to send it back to the Fed. And again, it pays for utilities, it pays for all of, in fact, there's money for even broadband right now. If you're having trouble paying for your internet connection, your phone, things that are helping you live your life right now while we're in this interesting transition, all of that is supporting, being supported right now. So please see renthelpnm.org for that info. Keep fighting with us. We're already into the interim session where we're having meetings. We're talking about housing. We need money. We need to get it in the budget. So sit with us in these, long meetings. But also, if you have information, please share it with us. Andrea@andrearomero.com. Email me. Very easily accessible, andrearomero.com, to send emails so that we have the data, that you have information that you want to share with us about how we can help. So we're trying to be as proactive as we can, but the fact that we have money right now, let's spend it.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say also that like a lot of social and racial justice issues that many in our communities are concerned with, like there are really strong champions like us in the legislature, and there's few of us, I guess, in comparison to the folks who really have like the kind of power that we need to build for our communities. And so I know that it's issues like this that can certainly be really frustrating. But I'm certainly inspired every day by a lot of the community folks that we meet, and I urge folks to just keep at it, that this work is super important. I also want to add that I think there's folks in the legislature who just assume that this issue is only impacting larger communities, and the fact is that it's impacting rural communities all across the state, and we need to make sure that rural communities who don't actually have the capacity and the funding that many of us do in the larger communities, that we try to provide these types of like panels and things like this so that we can empower folks in other parts of the state. And so hopefully we can just continue to do that.
Awesome. Thank you again, everybody. And please make sure to catch us again next month. It's a monthly series. So we're always going to come back and talk about all things housing. And again, we're addressing housing full spectrum, so and statewide. So we hope to see you again. And thank you everyone for being here tonight, my incredible panel and everybody else that joined and had questions. I will see you all very soon, and make sure to stay tuned. We'll see you next month. Thank you, everybody.